Monday, and that so happens to be the day that I like to talk about monsters. Hello and welcome to Monster Mondays. I am Geoff Arbuckle, co-host of the podcast Film Seizure that you can catch each Wednesday morning at filmseizure.com or at a number of podcast providers online. Now, I don't know how many people realized in 1958 when they saw the first Dracula film starring Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing that the series would still be going on 15 years later. I definitely believe that Christopher Lee didn't think it would be a 15-year job for him, and I would go so far as to think that he didn't want it to be a 15-year job. But here we are. 1973's The Satanic Rites of Dracula would be the last time Hammer would feature Christopher Lee as the Transylvanian Count. The series had its ups and downs, but for the most part, Hammer knew what they were doing. Christopher Lee was a massive star in horror. He, along with Cushing, had fully ascended to the level of the greats like Bela Lugosi, Boris Karloff, and Vincent Price. However, it was no secret that Lee hated doing the Dracula films. I think he was more than happy with the first, but felt the constant defeat and return of Dracula was just a waste of the character and the greatness of that first film. It's also fabled that he had to constantly be lured back by Hammer to continue playing the part by having producers and studio folks saying that he would be putting a lot of people out of work if he didn't do the movies anymore. And that's kind of funny that was their plea to Lee. But while I do generally like the Hammer Dracula films, I'm also liking the films on very shallow terms. First, Christopher Lee is just awesome. I have to set aside that he didn't like the scripts because his selective reading of dialogue was just very cool. And that made him very ominous as Dracula. Second, the scenery was pretty great too. I mean, the Gothic style in most of the films being set in the past in Eastern European countrysides, etc., is just great. It's what you think of with Dracula, and it has so much atmosphere that I begin to really feel like I could look out my window and see the exact same scenery that I saw on my television screen whenever I watch these movies. And thirdly, I really like the scenery. I mean, there are no more beautiful women in horror than those hired by Hammer. I think I'll just leave it at that. Now, admittedly, the Dracula series is full of hit or miss entries and moments, but I do just kind of like putting one on and just going with whatever it wants to do in the plot. The movies sometimes have, some threadbare continuity from one movie to the next, but The Satanic Rites of Dracula is one that has direct continuity with the previous film, Dracula AD 1972. Interestingly enough, it's also these last two films in the series that are also often the ones that get the most critiques from people too. But anyway, in Dracula AD 1972, Lee's Dracula was basically brought into the present day London's, after suffering a defeat at the hands of Cushing's Van Helsing character. And Cushing also plays a descendant of Van Helsing, and his granddaughter, Jessica, in that film was played by Stephanie Beacham. Her mod friends are part of the group that brought Dracula back to life. He's defeated again. But this movie basically picks up right where, Dracula in 1972 was, and to have basically Cushing's Van Helsing be on the chase of the vampire once again. But in The Satanic Rites of Dracula, Jessica Van Helsing is played by Joanna Lumley. Now, Lumley was a somewhat new face on the scene. In 1969, she had a very small part in On Her Majesty's Secret Service, the criminally underrated Bond film that starred George Lazenby, that we actually just featured on Film Seizure last month. I mean, check out that episode for more about that movie. But Lumley would be best known for her role in the British comedy Absolutely Fabulous. Now, this is a unique Dracula movie in the franchise. The script was by Don Houghton, who kind of employs this curious mix of the typical Dracula Gothic horror, but also brings in sci-fi and has a little bit of spy thriller thrown in for good measure. While it's often called the least interesting of the Hammer Dracula films, I kind of actually disagree. There are things in this movie that are interesting and have some neat ideas that they could really work with, and could have really worked with a lot more if they were allowed to expand on those plot points and ideas. But I digress. Don Houghton, as a side note, wrote my all-time favorite Doctor Who serial, Inferno, in 1970. That's a tale I will likely feature on Monster Mondays in the future, and it's definitely one that also gets a lot of really high praise in the Doctor Who fan circles. But before we get into this movie, I do want to talk about the title and another case of Christopher Lee not wanting to do this film. The working title of the movie was, and I kid you not, Dracula is Dead and Well and Living in London. It was a parody of a popular musical revue called Jacques Brel is Alive and Well and Living in Paris. I'm not sure if it was ever intended to keep that title. I mean, famously, Return of the Jedi, when it was in production, had the working title of Blue Harvest. And it was not ever meant to, retain that title and keep that title, but it was officially listed as such when it would secure locations and etc. Still, the press had a bit of a field day with this silly Dracula title. In 1973, there was a press conference that Lee was at where he basically said he was doing the whole damn movie under protest. He hated the title. He hated that it was slapped onto a movie, and it was a parody title that was not at all a comedy. I mean, in fact, there is not a single joke in this movie. There is nothing in this movie to even chuckle at. He was hating everything, and I love grumpy Christopher Lee so much. But in France, the title actually stuck, but in the French language, obviously. But it was ultimately retitled upon release to The Satanic Rites of Dracula. It wasn't released in the United States until 1979, where it was heavily edited and had a title change yet again to Count Dracula and His Vampire Bride. That title is what it's often used in the public domain. And yeah, that version of the movie did fall into the public domain, which means that it's very commonly seen in a lot of cheapo film packs. It is, found on YouTube under that title. And I also believe under that title, the movie landed in the dubious arena of Siskel and Ebert's Dogs of the Week on their old sneak preview show on Chicago Public Television. But this movie begins at a large house seemingly either outside of London or in the middle of nowhere, and there's a satanic ritual going on. It appears that they are planning to sacrifice a girl, but we later see that it has something to do with the killing of a rooster and draining of its blood onto the girl's torso. This is not an uncommon thing in these Dracula movies. There's some sort of satanic thing going on, and it's being performed by what appears to be mostly bored, rich, old dudes. Honestly, I'm beginning to think that a lot of old, rich British dudes really did get into the weirdo occult stuff. But this cult has captured a guy who is a Secret Service agent. He manages to escape and tells his superior that there are 4 pretty prominent people who are taking part in these occult goings on. One guy is a government official named John Porter. Another is a peer named Lord Carradine, which might actually be a reference to John Carradine, but I digress. There's a military general named Freeborn, and a pretty famous scientist named Professor Julian Keeley. They are part of a group that's led by a mysterious woman named Chen Yang. The agent dies shortly after the reveal of the members of the cult. They call in a man from Scotland Yard, Inspector Murray. Now, Murray knows a thing or two about the occult and is able to kind of work on the side, basically, because as it turns out, John Porter is the head or is the minister who's in charge of all the security, which is where the Secret Service falls into. So they kind of have to work in these kind of unofficial channels. So that's why they bring in Murray to kind of work on the sly for the Secret Service. He was also in the last movie, so he knows a thing or two about occult stuff going on. Now, when the Secret Service and Murray review the photos, they see 4 important men that were named by the agent. But the 5th and final picture was supposed to contain another member of the cult, another prominent member of the cult. But it must have, they think that the agent must have just kind of snapped the picture errantly, because the picture just shows the front door of the house where all these rituals happen, and there is no 5th person. Now, Secret Service Secretary Jane, who did the recording, who transcribes everything, who files everything away for the Secret Service, is sent home to take a rest. But a couple cult members chase her down and capture her, and she's delivered to who else? Count Dracula, who basically turns her into one of his slaves. Now, meanwhile, Murray brings in Van Helsing. And Van Helsing listens to the recording from the agent and learns more about the satanic ritual that does end with apparently that woman that is shown that has all of the rooster blood dripped all over. She does end up being sacrificed, but is revived with her wounds disappearing in front of in front of the cult member's eyes. Now, he knows that there was something more to this black mass than just some old rich guys being weirdos. Van Helsing knows Professor Keeley pretty well, and he wants to find out directly from Keeley if he's really involved with all this devil stuff. So he goes to visit Keeley at his institute, but it doesn't go unnoticed by cult members who are watching outside. Inside the Institute, Van Helsing does find Keeley, who is very shifty, nervous, and quite disheveled. He goes on and on about having completed, quote-unquote, it. Now, whatever he's done, it has something to do with the 23rd of the month. And he keeps saying the things like evil rules over everything. And after Van Helsing finally slaps him around to kind of help him get a hold of some sanity, he learns that Keeley has created a new strain of the bubonic plague. And it has been completed, and it can be spread simply by touch. It's not an airborne plague, and that's really important. It has to be passed by touch. And it basically instantly infects someone once it's been passed to them. The cult gathers Keeley and attempts to kill Van Helsing, but the bullet only grazes his head. When Van Helsing wakes up, he sees Keeley is hanging from the ceiling dead, and his cultured samples of the plague that were on his desk are now missing. That same night, Murray, Torrance, and Torrance, who is of the Secret Service, who is kind of the superior of the agent who was originally captured, and Van Helsing's granddaughter, Jessica, go to the country house where the rituals take place. Now, Torrance and Murray question Chen Yang, but Jessica goes into the cellar where she finds Jane chained to the wall, but she's already been turned vampire. The women who are used in the rituals at the house also rise out of coffins in a pretty cool scene to basically try to attack Jessica as well, but she's only able to escape when she screams, and it tips Torrance and Murray off to shenanigans in the basement. Jane nearly bites Torrance when he wants to free her, thinking that it is his secretary, but Murray is able to basically stake Jane with a piece of one of the cult members' coffins. Now, Murray, Torrance, and Jessica need to escape because they realize that Chin realizes that they realize what's going on there. They discover that a D.D. Denham is financing Keeley's work. And Denham's company's board is basically filled with all the men who are part of the cult. Van Helsing believes that that the only person who could do all of this is none other than Count Dracula himself. Chen Yang may have been the disciple who was able to bring Dracula back from the dead. And Denham owns the plot of land where the church that Dracula was killed at the end of the previous film was. And considering the groundbreaking of the business park took place shortly after Van Helsing defeated Dracula, he suspects that the other vampires in the basement of that house have been missing since shortly after the groundbreaking took place. So Van Helsing and Jessica prepare Torrance Murray and the now former head of the Secret Service, thanks to Porter protecting Dracula, a man by the name of Colonel Matthews, about how they can find Dracula, why the 23rd of the month is so important, which has to deal with a particular evil Sabbath, and what they must do next to defeat the evil. While staking out the Chen Yang's place, Colonel Matthews and Torrance are both assassinated by a sniper. Jessica and Murray are nearly killed by that sniper as well, but they are captured instead. Van Helsing decides to go see Denham and makes a little silver bullet from a cross that he owns. And Denham speaks in a heavy accent, sits in the shadows, and shines a light at Van Helsing's face. But we all know this is obviously Christopher Lee sitting there. And it's totally Dracula. And Van Helsing does make Dracula reveal himself by having him accidentally touch a Bible on his desk. And Van Helsing is knocked out by Dracula's goon squad before he's able to shoot Dracula with this silver bullet. And Dracula decides to torture Van Helsing a little bit by taking him to the country house to reveal the grand scheme that he has. Now there, Murray was delivered to Chen Yang, who herself is a vampire, but he's able to avoid being bitten by her by tossing a net over her that was in the cellar and staking her with some random sharp wood and a mallet that was also down there with him. And I kind of feel like that should not be in the basement where vampires live, but anyway, Murray is on the loose. Dracula has plans for his disciples, which also now include, his plans now also include Van Helsing and Jessica. Jessica is to be his consort and will be unaffected by the plague, but for Porter, Carradine, Freeborn, and Van Helsing, they will be Dracula's four horsemen of a new apocalypse. They are to be infected by the plague and will carry it forth to the world and kill everyone. Now, Dracula wants Porter to smash open the vial carrying the plague, and when he does, it infects him immediately. Murray, watching from a security room, is basically attacked by one of the other cult member security guard guys. And when he basically fights off the security guy and sends the guy into the, I guess it's the, I don't know, like the controls or whatever, it electrocutes the guy and it sends a overload of electricity through everything, and it sets the house on fire. And Porter and the plague basically burn with the house while Dracula tries to attack Van Helsing. Van Helsing escapes out the window, and Murray saves Jessica, and they escape out away from the fire. Van Helsing lures Dracula into a hawthorn bush, and now that's the bush where the supposed thorns on Christ's crown came from. So it really hurts Dracula to get these thorns kind of scratching at him. And trapped by these holy thorns, Van Helsing stakes Dracula, and Dracula disintegrates into ash. And at the very last moment of the movie, Van Helsing picks up Dracula's ring. And I think that's to assume basically if he possesses that, no one else will be able to bring Dracula back to life. But let's talk about the three things I like about the Satanic Rites of Dracula. First up, I do like that this movie does try to escape the series' dependence on the typical gothic horror stuff. This movie is definitely much more of a spy thriller than anything else, especially in the first 2/3 of the movie. Yes, there is horror stuff going on, but being a more modern movie, it's treated differently than the usual villager teaming up with a religious man type of movie that we've seen previously. I do like that it is trying to be something different. The movie finishes with mixed results on that attempt to be something different, but that attempt is good enough to be more interesting and not exactly the same old, same old. Second, to go along with the different style of the movie, there is also a different style to the horror scene when Dracula goes to Secretary Jane's room to basically bite her and turn her into a vampire. It starts with her waking up in the room. You know, they always toss their captives in. It was the same room that was seen earlier when the agent was stored and captured. And she wakes up seeing the light overhead swinging. The room is dirty. The bed she's on has a crappy mattress. There's no covers. The shutter on the window is swinging and banging against the window. It has a more thriller-like feel with a kidnapping victim than a monster movie. Then the door to the room starts shaking and kind of jiggling like the handle's being messed with. And you see fog under the door, indicating that Dracula is here. The door flies open and he comes in. From there, it becomes much more the typical vampire situation where he seduces and bites her. But it's a good scene that kind of plays with the senses a little bit and is a pretty well-constructed set of shots to show how terrifying it might be for Jane to wake up in that room without any idea of what is about to happen. Thirdly, I have to admit, I really do like Dracula's plan. I think it's pretty wonderful. Van Helsing says Dracula always comes back with some plan for revenge, and usually that revenge has something to do with a holy man or Van Helsing or whatever. But this time, seems as though Dracula is wanting a far more grand revenge. That is by far and away more than anything he's ever wanted before. He basically wants the entire world to burn and perish. Sure, Van Helsing brings up that Dracula would rule a world that is completely dead from the plague, but he's so crazed by his centuries-long desire for vengeance, he doesn't really care, and this is only furthered by his near unwavering desire to make Jessica his bride, just to stick it that much more to Van Helsing. It's demented and it's demonic what he wants to do. It's maybe one of the most talkative scenes that Lee ever had as Dracula, and it's all directed right toward Peter Cushing's Van Helsing. It's, so much so that his plan is kind of broken by being too focused on hurting Van Helsing on a much deeper level than just killing him. It causes him to pretty much hesitate, and it leads to his own ultimate demise. It's a really great scene, and the whole monologue he spouts is just plain old evil. It's a great way for Lee to bid farewell to this role and his long rivalry in the series with Cushing directly. But real quick, before I put the wraps on this week's episode and Christopher Lee as Dracula, I do want to say that this is not the last Hammer Dracula film. The honor would go to 1974's The Legend of the Seven Golden Vampires. That was a co-production between Hammer and Shaw Brothers Studio and was taking advantage of the new Kung Fu craze. Dracula was played by John Forbes Robertson and was only really seen at the very end of the movie. And Peter Cushing did return as Van Helsing. And while it was also the final time that Lee played the Count in this movie, the films in which he played Dracula, for Hammer weren't the only times that he, donned the fangs. He appeared in a 1970 film by Spanish director Jess Franco called Count Dracula, which was an attempt to adapt the Stoker novel much closer than maybe it ever had been up to that point. Also, Wikipedia said it was his 100th film too. But in 1971, he also played both Dracula and himself in another Spanish film that was labeled a little bit more of an experimental film, as it's kind of the story of the making of the Franco film. I definitely plan to get around someday to that Jess Franco Count Dracula film. But there are also the 2 Dracula sequels that Lee was not part of, The Brides of Dracula and that the Legend of the 7 Golden Vampires. They're also on my list as well. So someday I'll get to those, but this may be the last time that Christopher Lee played Dracula, but it wasn't the only times that he played the characters. So I do plan to get to the others that he was a part of, and also the ones that he was not part of, to really kind of bring the whole thing to a close, at least for those 2 that Hammer did that he was not a part of. But that wraps up this week's Monster Mondays. You can catch new episodes of Monster Mondays each Monday at filmseizure.com. Don't forget to follow Film Seizure at Facebook, Threads, and Instagram, and subscribe to Film Seizure to get both the Film Seizure podcast and Monster Mondays at your favorite podcast providers. You can also subscribe to us on YouTube, where we post all the episodes there as well. You can also check out my website, bmovieanima.com, to read new review articles every Friday morning. Next time, let's head out to a remote Pacific Ocean island. No, we're not looking for King Kong, but we will have to defend ourselves against a pretty nasty attack of the crab monsters. So until next week, stay spooky.